Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. I can't quite believe that the economic crisis is so bad that you'd rather be in a tent than going for a walk. My name is Jean Seaton and I'm the director of the Orwell Prize. All this week we have been conducting a series of arguments and explorations, actually I think all of them addressed to out of history into our current circumstances. And we are extremely, and if you want to follow the future of the Orwell Prize, the shortlist of both the Journalism and the Book Prize will be announced on the 22nd of April on our rather wonderful website. You can always see it there, and you can see yourself there on our films. I'm very proud this afternoon to have gathered for you such an extraordinarily knowledgeable and expert series of speakers to actually consider what the political consequences of the economic crisis that we are, whatever you want to call it, and that's one of the things that come up, that we're going through now will be, because there will be political crises, that there will be political changes, there may be some political opportunities. As a historian, I always think that actually, rather as Orwell showed in 1984, that history never repeats itself, but there's actually no better evidence of where we are for the complexity of things than history. On our panel, I'm really, really pleased. We've got Dr. Patricia Clavin, a local from Jesus College. Patricia has written really extensively on the economic crisis in the 1930s and said that she'd quite recently forgotten the details of the trade figures in 1932, so don't ask her those. But what she knows about the way in which that 1930s crisis paid out is extraordinary, and she's written a number of very distinguished books, and you know, she gives us that background. So we're extremely pleased to have her here. Mark Thompson is on our shortlist for an extraordinary book called The White War, which is about the Italian front during the First World War, but it's really also about the political fallout of conflicts and the development of certain kinds of nationalism. But wearing another hat, which is how I know him, he works all over Eastern Europe, really producing the most extraordinary, system for understanding what's happening to the media in Eastern Europe. So we're extremely pleased on all sorts of counts to have him here. And Will Hutton, I'm sure, actually needs no introduction. Not only is he the author of The Stateroom, which he just joked, if only people had listened to what he said in The Stateroom, we'd just be having a depression, not a recession. Sorry, a recession, not a depression. But he writes very regularly, and it brings, in a way, a unique combination of political sensitivity and economic understanding. But it seems to me that that combination has been missing in many of our debates. He also is on the board of Political Quarterly, which is one of our sponsors, so we are very, very pleased to have him here. Patricia, perhaps you'd just like to start giving us a bit of background.
Well, when I was invited to participate in the panel, the first thing I was reminded of was that 1939 was also the anniversary of Coming Up for Air, which was published in 1939, and I wanted to start really with a little quote from it in the way that George Bowling describes his wife Hilda, because I found this can you hear me at the back? Yes, a sort of a reminder of the way that people feel about economic uncertainty, whether it's a recession or a depression. George Bowling described his wife Hilda as a woman with a perpetual brooding, worried look in her eyes. She's worried about the price of butter, the size of the gas bill, payments due on the radio bought on tick, and her children's boots wearing out. She has it firmly fixed in her head that we will end up in the workhouse, though George, her husband, suspects that if they do, Hilda won't mind it as much as him. In fact, she'll rather enjoy the feeling of security. And that's a very striking sense of vulnerability, really, that a woman who is living in a semi-detached house in actual comparative prosperity in the 1930s would prefer the security of the workhouse. And insecurity is something, as a theme that plagues the history of the 1930s. insecurity is the reason that in Europe, in Central and South America, authoritarian and fascist governments particularly were able to seize power. They exploited a variety of insecurities that people had in response to the economic crisis. And the theme, whether political crisis follows from economic crisis, in some senses it should. There has to be a vigorous debate about where economic crisis and uncertainty has come from, as there had been to some extent in the 1930s, but perhaps it wasn't vigorous enough. In the 1930s too, the economic crisis translated into an international crisis. And of course the result of that at the end of 1939 was the outbreak of the Second World War. Some of the most serious problems, and one of the reasons that the Allies nearly lost the Second World War, was the tremendous tensions that existed in British, French and American relations from about 1931, certainly through until 38-39. And those tensions existed because of the uncoordinated way that Britain, France and the United States responded to the Great Depression. And in some respects, Great Depression, economic depressions, pose particular questions and challenges for democracies and for open economies. There was serious tension and difficulties between Britain and the United States in 1939 as Britain began to rearm and Americans started selling sterling on the international market because they were afraid that their investments were going to go pear-shaped. In the Second World War, there was a generation of economists, politicians, and people who sought as far as possible to learn from the history of the Depression. And that was a learning experience which was sort of buried very deep within them. And it began, many of the economists and politicians who I've studied were thinking about economic crisis from 1918, 1919, because there had been a series of them through the 20s, through the 30s. And it was those economists who planned Bretton Woods and who also thought about the shortcomings of Bretton Woods as an international architecture. And I've been sort of astonished. I know we're going to hear more about the G20 from Will in a minute, but how much of it, some of it's cast as new, was already around in 1944. And the sort of sense that actually depression, recession or depression was an ever-present crisis, that it had to be that politicians and societies had to be ever vigilant for the different sources of economic difficulty. And that's a lesson that we've forgotten.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.